Morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Welcome. My name is Jim Lynch. It is my absolute privilege to serve as the Executive Director of ASA and a real pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Human 3.0, Change the Game, Change Your Life. And we all know this is a time of great stress and anxiety in our communities. It was before that, like that before COVID. It's certainly more so in the wake of working our way through COVID. We all see the consequences on mental health, substance abuse, and other critical issues that we care a lot about. Today, we're joined by Dr. Raj Najawan to talk about the causes for the stress and anxiety, and more importantly, how we can apply what we know about the brain to thrive personally and professionally. Back in 2014, Dr. Najawan founded the Life Ecology Organization, or LEO, with a mission to establish dynamic work communities to help society in these challenging times. A Milwaukee native and healthcare leader in anesthesiology and critical care, Raj has spent 30 years cataloging, teaching, and helping people integrate the latest knowledge from medical, social, and brain science into their lives. LEO has now grown to include a diverse team of scientists, educators, storytellers, and thought leaders working to bring these insights to as many people as possible. And as some of us have really come to know in the last couple of years, especially educators. Raj, thank you for all you do here at ASA. We have really appreciated our work with you over the last couple of years. And thanks for being here today and joining us for the webinar.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Jim. It's been a really great partnership, and our team is sort of falling in love with working with school systems. It's been a really pleasant surprise over the last couple of years. And so we're really grateful to you for your leadership and giving us the opportunity to sort of teach this set of tools. So thank you so much. And just some housekeeping, we are recording this, and so we'll make that, Jim and I have talked about this, we'll make this recording available to you. So don't go too crazy trying to take notes right now. You're welcome to, of course, but try to soak it in the big picture, and you can always circle back and come back to the recording, and then we'll also share the slide deck with you. And really, we'll hit the ground running right away. The idea behind this title, and we won't get to the Human 3.0 part probably until later on, but we'll stick with this sort of change the story, change your life idea. And that was inspired by the book Sapiens. Jim and I were talking about that by Yuval Noah Harari, that the reason the Homo sapiens defeated the Neanderthals is really attributed to storytelling and the ability to create mythology and shared value systems that allowed us to expand the size of our tribe. By brain size, we are actually able to tolerate up to 150 intimate relationships, but the ability to tell stories and have shared narrative allowed us to expand that to the thousands. Now, this part of the brain is truly fascinating, and right out of the gates, we're going to share kind of a brain hack. We call these brain hacks to allow you to become more psychologically resistant to stress, resilient, and creatively fearless, and then to teach this to others. That's the big picture here. And so this part of the brain, the orbital prefrontal cortex, fascinating things happen with it. For example, there's something called the Pepsi paradox, where if you do a taste test looking at cans of Pepsi versus Coke, and you can see the labels, typically taste tests, Coke will win. But if you cover the labels, Pepsi typically wins. And what's very interesting is if you have an injury to the part of the brain called the orbital prefrontal cortex, which is the first brain hack we're talking about, Pepsi always wins, which is profound. It means that this part of the brain, storytelling machinery, actually changes our biological experience of the world in conjunction with the thalamus. Don't worry about the alphabet soup. Similarly, wine taste testing. If you can see the price or the labels, the more expensive wines win. When you cover the labels, they all come out equal. So storytelling, very powerful. So powerful that it's the key to addiction, and we will submit to you it's the key to stress and the key to happiness and the key to how effective you are as a human being. So we really want to adopt more and more frameworks to be able to look at the world differently and not be affected negatively, and stay really in what we call a higher brain dominant mode, which we'll explain to you. And the implications are profound. It's about stress elimination. It's about being creatively fearless. And it's about being more dynamic as an innovator in whatever field you're in. And in your case, being dynamic and creating learning environments and positive culture and helping with poor behavior on the part of students and even the parents in some instances. So that's what we mean by change your story. We're going to teach you a lot of brain hacks that you can plant in the orbital prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain that allow you to become what we call higher brain dominant. Where this story sort of came from is that as a young man in med school, I really struggled in the transition from books, which I was great at, to people, which it turns out I was horrible at. So the transition from second year to third year at med school is pretty dramatic, especially 35 years ago. And that was shocking to my system. I had so few life skills, and everything, all kinds of mental health issues got exposed: anxiety, insecurity, type A personality, narcissism, sociopathy. I was a mess. So I took a year off to figure out whether I could even finish med school, and luckily met my wife to be, my wife of 35 years, who conveniently is a psychotherapist. She helped stabilize me, and then a dear friend of mine who's a year ahead of me in med school, is like a big brother to me, really helped me to fall in love with self-help literature and how to become more effective as a human being. So I'm so grateful for those two, that really saving my life. And then I also acquired a master's in clinical research. I designed and ran medical trials. So the medical background combined with the science background, combined with a passion for self-help, I just started accumulating tools, mostly to help myself stabilize psychologically and become more effective as a human being. And so for me, I have zero judgment for anybody for any mental health struggle, but I'm really hopeful based on what I've experienced and what we've taught to others. And so really, about 10 years ago, we started to aggregate. So we have what we call the 5 A's of aggregate. So what we call ourselves Leo, and Paul Riemann is on here, and Michelle McGrath is also on here. They're really important parts of the team and trainers, excellent parts of the team. And so we aggregate discoveries in brain science, social science, evolutionary biology, and turn them into practical tools and then test them to see how they work. And we've had some pretty profound results, very hopeful. And so we're agile in the sense that we iterate pretty rapidly. We've done probably between 400 to 500 workshops in the last 4 years. And so we're constantly getting feedback and optimizing how these are working in terms of being accessible intellectually, emotionally, practically, financially. And the results have been really remarkable. So this is the initial part of this presentation is a little bit disturbing, but this is a very hopeful story and very practical and immediately impactful, even what you're going to hear. And we've got an hour of this presentation, and then we have a half an hour to talk. So we've got a total of an hour and a half. So plenty of time for you to sort of play around with these ideas and ask questions. And I think, the 5th A is this airplane idea, which is, I think, our heart goes out to you leaders of school systems. You've had a brutal 2 years. It's a tough role anyways, but it's been made extremely difficult. And I just feel like school staff don't get enough credit for how they've been stuck in between all these, mental health epidemic and social revolutions and political revolutions. And so I think it's really critical, like, in the airplane when it's turbulent and the mask falls down, to put it on yourself first and then to help the others. I think not enough attention is placed on school staff. I think it makes sense for school staff to really be empowered and become psychologically, stress resistant and resilient in order to then have that effect on the rest, on the students and even the parents. And what seems to be unique about our approach is we focus on the school staff, and we figure the students will be taught automatically down the line, informally and formally. So that's Leo. And really, we've really been aggregating and testing for the past approximately 10 years. Sarah Engel-Stryker, who's also on here as Leo team in the background, she's been instrumental in helping me to build this. And then over the last 3-4 years, a lot of great people have come on board to help us accelerate, like Paul and Michelle. And so the essence of this program is that we're going to teach you brain hacks to increase your discomfort tolerance that's going to lead to you being more dynamic, that your brain is actually tricking you into being a lot more self-protecting than you want to. And if you aren't intentional about this or scientific about it, it's going to cause a lot more anxiety, stress, boredom, depression, addiction, suffering, self-destruction, and it happens slowly, so you don't even notice that it's happening. So it's vital. And we'll explain also why, as Americans in particular, we are what we call very lower brain dominant right now. There's good explanations for it, why it's happening now, and also good things that we can do to turn that around very quickly. So again, very hopeful. And so, one of the concepts that we talk about is say, listen, there's an old part, we call it the older brain. It's not the reptilian brain. The reptilian brain has been around for well past 3 to 5 million years. We're talking about the limbic system, which is really about 2 to 2.5 million years old. And when we ask people, why is that there? Why is this older brain there? People say fight or flight and survival, and those are all decent answers. But in fact, there's a more profound reason that this part of the brain showed up. And the way natural selection works, as you know, it's a simple way to understand it is that genes are mutating all the time. If you have a bad mutation, it leads to cancer. If you have a good mutation, it can lead to a functional advantage in that context, in that point in time. And so for the last 2.5 million years, we've been hunter-gatherers. Farming is 0.001% of human history. It's almost non-existent on a time scale. We are hunter-gatherers first and foremost. We have hunter-gatherer brains. And so the context of that is that we had a very short life expectancy, 27 years. Violence-related deaths, despite what you see on social media and regular media, violence-related deaths were 4 to 5 times greater than they are now. And so because we were dying at a pretty young age, what kind of mutation would come along that would allow us to have our genes succeed and get to the next generation? That's how natural selection works. Mutations that come along that allow the genes to survive that context, are more likely to get passed on. And so the quality that showed up randomly and then stuck around was the propensity to be selfish. We're designed to be selfish because our obsession with social rank and acquisition of opportunity are all mating advantages. And so, we needed to quickly ascend the social hierarchy, be able to mate, and then pass our genes on. And the genes say, bye-bye, thanks for the ride. And they were on to the next generation, and they don't care about our older selves because we were dying at a pretty young age. And so, unfortunately, that system, as you can see here on the left, is very self-destructive. Fight or flight, people always talk about survival and fight or flight, but moment to moment, this, what we call lower brain, is causing suffering, stress. We call it SAD. Suffering, stress and anxiety, apathy, addiction, depression, and destruction from the stress response, cortisol, and its degrading effect on the brain and the body. So really bad stuff. This thing's being triggered constantly by the modern world. In the meantime, in this just the last couple 100,000 years, something else, another mutation showed up, the higher brain. And this has profound implications, as you can see here. These are all neural networks that correspond to all these qualities, lower brain and higher brain. They're just basically neural networks, focus network, awareness network, psychological stability, and you can kind of read the list for yourself. Pretty profound implications if you are more higher brain dominant. And this is where it's a good news or a good news, bad news, good news story. The good news is, turns out you have these two superpowers. Your thoughts actually control where the blood goes in your brain. That is of profound importance, especially in the context of what the implications are. The implications of being lower brain are really bad. The implications of being higher brain are really good. But who's being conscious about their brains and being scientific and shifting themselves higher? Almost nobody, right? Because we're still catching up to all these discoveries. The other superpower you have is called neuroplasticity, which most of you here, this is a very learned group. We know about school leaders. And neuroplasticity simply means the ability to grow and shrink any part of your brain, neuroplastic. Again, that superpower, we know how to accelerate it now, and we're going to talk about that next. But that is a superpower because of the implications of lower brain and higher brain. And so the bad news is lower brain has a lot more tricks up its sleeve. And so if you're unconscious about this life, you're almost guaranteed to be a lower brain. 9 out of 10 people, which is what's happening right now, especially for Americans. The good news is we know how to harness these superpowers to become higher brain dominant within minutes, hours and days in a sustainable way. And so this represents kind of a second brain hack. The first brain hack was the change the story idea, where you can plant a lot of new frameworks in your brain to change how you experience the world. This is another motivational brain hack, which is look at the profound implications. And to be honest, there's nothing in life that's more meaningful than becoming higher brain dominant. And there's nothing more purposeful than to teach other people to become higher brain dominant. And then, oh, by the way, icing on the cake is as you become higher brain dominant, you become more and more creatively fearless, and you're just having fun all the time, constantly optimizing all aspects of your life. And so you as school leaders have an incredible opportunity. To me, it's like you're the last stand to save society. Because as far as communal mechanisms, communal opportunities to shift a whole community to a higher level of functioning, civic organizations are almost gone. Religious participation has gone way down. Small town participation gone. As far as communal mechanisms, there's almost nothing left except for organizations who aren't thinking about this stuff as much. And schools. I think schools represent an incredible opportunity to elevate society and teach people, young people and their parents and community more broadly, how to become more higher brain dominant. So that's what we're really excited to share with you, because we think you are the key to the future as far as I'm concerned. And so this program, what we do is we teach, and I'm going to give you a sampling of that, but brain hacks to shut off the lower brain and brain hacks to activate the higher brain. That's it. That's the whole gist. And this is the payoff. And so that's why it's really pretty cool and pretty important. Okay. And by the way, we'll have, like I said, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end to really connect. And so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but neuroplasticity, you know about it. There's lots of studies to show that we have an infinite ability to grow and shrink any part of our brain. That's a fact now. From the nun study, where they did a study on nuns' brains. There was about 800 of them, and they studied their brains after they died. And a lot of them had enough Alzheimer's plaques that they should have gotten Alzheimer's, and none of them got Alzheimer's. So what happened? They were able to reroute neural networks around the plaques to prevent the Alzheimer's from happening. Really cool. Musicians, the famous 10,000-hour study was derived from the work of Anders Ericsson in Germany, showing that once you get to 7,500 or 10,000, as Malcolm Gladwell popularized, the more hours, the more that part of the brain expanded. And so really genius is a function of time, not a function of talent. That is gone in terms of believing that talent is the key. That has now been disproven. And other examples like taxi drivers studying their brains and how they change over time based on how much they use them to memorize maps in London, for example. So one thing for you to think about is, what are the key predictors of neuroplasticity, the ability to grow and shrink your brain? Think about that for a second and give you a little bit of a break in the action here. And really, time is a key factor. The other one that's surprising is feedback tolerance. It's your ability to tolerate feedback that's the key. The more feedback you get in terms of metrics or coaching or competition, what's working, what's not working, positive and negative, that's feedback, right? And so when I say I want to give you some feedback, what's the first thing that happens? Your tummy starts to churn and your heart drops, and it's like, feedback, get away from me, right? So who wants feedback? But it turns out that's the key to neuroplasticity, and that's one of the superpowers, and that's the key to becoming higher brain dominant. And so we really want to harness neuroplasticity, and we're going to give you a couple of brain hacks to accelerate your ability your neuroplasticity superpower and blood flow control superpower in order to become more higher brain dominant. Okay, so another way to look at the Leo program and the construct is that you have to have more compassion for yourself and other people, because we have the ability. What's happened over time is our younger selves, through family influences, societal influences, random trauma experiences, you become more lower brain dominant invariably. And so these are powerful neural networks, like biking and driving and language, incredibly complex neural networks that are automatic and powerful, subconscious. Same thing happens with negative habits and lower brain tendencies. You cannot beat yourself up or anybody else for having these tendencies. It's programming that's done to you. So self-compassion is important, but at the same time, you cannot trust yourself because your lower brain is constantly protecting you and overdoing it, and therefore making life a lot more narrow and boring and depressing than it should be. And so we want to combat that. And so what we want to teach people is to be scientists of their brains and their lives and their relationships in order to become more dynamic. And then you will discover, and this is how you can make the culture of your school come alive, by helping all school staff realize that anybody can learn to become higher brain dominant, especially in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. We have a lot of that right now. Anybody can teach this to other people of how to become more higher brain dominant. And then finally, once you become more higher brain dominant, it's so stabilizing of the lower brain, you become more and more fearless creatively. And then you're having fun, innovating and assessing what's working. That's the creativity and the science, which is try something new, whether it's teaching or leadership or how to resolve conflict or bad behavior amongst students, like how to innovate and assess what's working and not working. You become more and more able to iterate faster, and it becomes really, truly interesting. And so this is another kind of motivational brain hack to motivate us to want to really devote the time to learn these kinds of tools and to start to shape our brain to become higher brain dominant. And so, and then another payoff of that is, as you become higher brain dominant, you realize there's unlimited demand for someone who is like that. Right. And so you don't have to worry about the future. A lot of the panic attack that's happening for Americans is worrying about the future. But if we give them a new narrative, the current narrative is, I don't know if I can keep up with the rest of the world. I don't know if we're going to be left behind. I don't know who's going to displace my culture. Who am I competing with for jobs? And there's all these fear narratives about the future. But if we give them a different narrative, which says you can become higher brain dominant, you can teach this to other people, the rest will be taken care of. You don't have to worry about it. It allows people to kind of calm down. And then if you do this as a community, which again, you have an opportunity to do that in schools, it's, forget about it. It's amazing what happens. And I've seen this happen in multiple instances, including school systems. And there's something beautiful that happens when you have a community that's tending towards more higher brain activity. You feel so secure and stable. You don't even worry about the future anymore. Okay, but meanwhile, back on Earth, the modern world is like kryptonite. What is happening? The more information comes in from media and social media, if you are unconscious about your brain, the tendency is going to be for you to go lower brain. The lower brain's been around, 10 times longer than the higher brain. It's got a lot more tricks. And it's sort of like Eeyore and Tigger combined. It's sort of worrying about the future and always telling a loss story, right? So the more information comes in, it turns out that loss potential is more sticky in the brain unless you're conscious about shifting the narrative in your brain. And so the modern world is causing a tremendous lower brain activation, especially for the haves, which is the United States. We as Americans are very lucky, blessed to have the resources, but we're addicted to the idea of being superior in status and material position. And there's threat to that now. And so that's causing a great lower brain activation, and we need to do something about it, and we can. And so, by the way, thanks to Michelle McGrath, who's on here. She's been a big reason that Leo has gotten into the school world. And then Jim Lynch was like gasoline on the fire for us because he's allowed us to present on this platform. We're grateful for that. And then many other school leaders and the DCF in Wisconsin, we've gotten a grant to deliver this to students, which has been very effective. And others like Paul Riemann and Sarah Engelstreicher have, a lot of people have made this happen. So we're grateful for that. And we just want to keep working with everybody to try to get these ideas out there. So thanks. And really, we have such an understanding now of the pain that you are all feeling as leaders of school systems, but we are excited to give you a toolkit, including what you're going to experience today already and coming forward, but also, a more expanded version if you're interested. And I think it can really help you in doing what I think is a vital job in stabilizing society. And so what's really exciting is to see some of the results that have happened. This is another kind of brain hack, if you will. But I think your role in helping society it cannot be underestimated. Everyone's been focusing so much on COVID and masks and all that stuff. But really, to me, the role in helping kids and young adults become higher brain dominant and accelerate the process of character development, nothing can be more important in helping our society stabilize and thrive even more. And so if you look at our outcomes data, this is our typical program is about 12 hours distributed over 3 to 6 months. And these are before and after results. And this again is hopeful information for you to be excited about working on your brain because it's going to work. It's going to pay off for sure. Every industry that we've worked with, every group that we worked with, including teachers, as you can see here, depression levels are consistent across industries. It's like 15 to 20% have significant depression. We do a survey before, during, and after the program with about 40 questions. Half of them have to do with mental health, and half of them have to do with what we call psychological safety, which is the ability to be more fearless creatively in an organization. That's culture. Like, how good is the culture? How dynamic is the culture? And you can see that, 3 to 6 months later, profound reductions in depression and anxiety, which is really exciting. And this represents close to 500 people. And then you may say, and by the way, most of these were before COVID, right? So it's even scarier to think what the levels are after COVID. Now, this teacher group was recently completed over a 6-month period. But then you may say, well, you know what, I don't have depression or anxiety. And the reality is the levels are quite high, but you become habituated to it. And you don't realize that you have it until you experience the opposite, when you start to notice shifts occurring in your brain. But even if you don't have it, the reality is that this is on a continuum. Lower brain versus higher brain, is on a 0 to 100. Maybe overt depression is your higher brain, you're down to a 0 to 20 level instead of being at 100 on your higher brain. But there's still a consequence of being on the lower end of the spectrum. Even if you don't have clinical depression or anxiety, there is a downstream effect of being more towards the lower brain side of the spectrum. And that's where this data is very exciting, is that, all these parameters, the downstream effect of lower brain activation is problems with energy, problems with sleep, problems with eating. And you can see that those improve profoundly. And what's interesting with the teacher group, the energy did not improve, but we did the survey at the worst time possible, which is the 3rd week of May, as we're getting towards the end of school. So of course, school staff are running around like chickens with their heads cut off to try to wrap up the end of the school year. And so it wasn't fair to ask them the energy question at that point. But again, these other effects, quite profound and very hopeful. And similarly, our results, our first cohort with the kids, high school students in Wood County, a profound reduction in suicidality and improvement in everything except for sleep. And this survey was done in the heart of COVID in 2020 rather. And so the survey was at the worst time possible. These are the worst possible results we could have gotten. Similarly, what's profound is that all parameters basically improve. And the only explanation for that is that the lower brain, people must be shutting their lower brains off. And then by definition, higher brain comes online, and that's what leads to better energy, better sleep, better eating habits, all the above. So extremely hopeful results, and at this time of being a scientist of your brain is really worth investing in. Okay, so let's take sort of a deeper dive and just kind of keep an eye on the clock, make sure we're not too far behind. The lower brain, as we've talked about, we use an acronym called CFAST: craving, fear, anxiety, stress, and thinking brains. And these are all specific neural networks. We're going to talk just a little bit about the craving brain and indirectly the fear brain. And one of the questions I would ask you to just think about is self-esteem important? Think about that for a second. Okay, that's all you're going to get for time, because everybody raises their hand and says, yes, self-esteem is important. Turns out we can make a strong argument the answer is no. And this is where it gets very interesting, okay? And this is a way we're going to teach you how to really shut that lower brain off and teach other people how to shut the lower brain off. The self-esteem brain is in the part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, and it corresponds to here, the nucleus accumbens, and it's the dopamine system, which almost everybody is familiar with now. But people focus mostly on, FOMO and likes and that kind of thing. They're not talking as much until recently about the fact that the dopamine levels can also drop. And that's the lower brain's way of manipulating us to get its agenda. The lower brain has the agenda of having higher social status and more opportunity and even more tribal affiliation in order to improve the odds of mating and the genes successfully moving on to the next generation. And then it doesn't care about us. And so we have to recognize that self-esteem is actually an evolutionary biological trick. You do not have to feel good about yourself to feel good and to be effective. In fact, we will argue that the opposite is true. So here's the dopamine system. You can see here the dopamine spikes, but it can also drop down. And really this emanates from this part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, but we can use change the story and things like areas like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to kind of tell a different narrative in order to reduce the destructive effect of the self-esteem brain. So let me put it to you, give you some perspective on that. So typically, if I were to ask you, you have to choose. Either you get really high self-esteem, you feel really good about yourself, or you get all these things on the right side: joy, power, fulfillment, meaning, purpose, connection. Which one would you pick if I forced you to pick one or the other? Of course, self-esteem goes in the garbage can, because all these things on the right are pretty awesome. And that is actually the choice that has to be made. Because remember, we talked about neuroplasticity. The key to neuroplasticity, and everything is a neural network. All these qualities on the right, fulfillment, purpose, meaning, connection, they're all neural networks. And so neuroplasticity is a function of feedback. But if you're worried about feeling good about yourself, you can't tolerate the feedback, like Jack Nicholson in a few, what was it called? A Few Good, what was the name of that movie? A Few Good Men, I think. Yeah. You can't handle the truth, right? If you're worried about feeling good about yourself, you can't handle the truth, you can't handle the feedback, you can't grow and learn as quickly, you can't expand those neural networks and social networks and even process maps and kind of mapping out how you do what you do, whether it's, again, leadership, teaching, behavior management, whatever it is, it's a neural network and a process. And so you can't improve that unless you can take feedback. So that's the problem with focusing on self-esteem. Self-esteem is like crack cocaine, literally, and we hooked on it, and then we can't tolerate the drop in it. And that's part of the explanation for why we're having a panic attack as Americans, is we're hooked on the high of being superior to everybody else. And now we can't tolerate the prospect of being equal or lesser than in some way. And so there's a little bit of an anxiety attack happening. But it's a false narrative. We do not have to be beholden to the self-esteem brain. We can just cycle fast and grow and be dynamic. In time, you can trigger, shut off, trigger, shut off, trigger, shut off, and you get past the self-esteem brain and it doesn't block you. And even the FOMO brain, fear of missing out, is the same dopamine system, and you can learn to not care about that either. Pursuit of pleasure here, okay? Why is it that we're stuck on this side? Because of this big one here. This guy is pulling down the scales to favor lower brain motivation because we want to avoid pain and discomfort. That dopamine level dropping when we have a loss of status or a loss of opportunity is discomfort. That's how the lower brain manipulates us in order to get its agenda, in order to pass the genes on to the next generation. And we can learn to get better and better at tolerating pain and discomfort, and then become more and more free to go to the right. And in fact, if you look at the neurochemistry of it all, it's really interesting that most people are stuck on validation and external pleasure. These are external sources of dopamine and even adrenaline. But the reality is, as you go to the right side of the equation, more higher brain dynamism and fearlessness and tranquility and peace and love and joy and all these, the range of hormones and neurotransmitters and electrical signals is so far superior, including being able to produce more dopamine than external pleasure and validation. Why? Dopamine is a novelty neurotransmitter. And so when you dot connect by learning and growing constantly and improving your process, improving your relationships, all those novelty experiences release dopamine. You have total control over that. It's more frequent, it's more robust, it's more novel than external experiences. External experiences, it's a narrative that we've created, but they are inferior to being creatively fearless and joyful in all aspects of your life. So another way to look at that is, maximum happiness. Logically, we should pursue maximum happiness. And maximum happiness is really, we say success in quotes, but a lot of people who are successful are driven by external validation and pleasure, and unfortunately become more and more self-protected. As the higher you go up in your rank and your position, the more self-protective you become, the more creatively fearful you are. And so your life becomes more and more narrow, and you have more and more stress by virtue of trying to protect what you have. But when you let go of that and you just focus on dynamism, you actually become more successful, and you get both of these. Stress levels go down, creative fearlessness goes up. And I think a lot of people who are successful are trapped because they haven't figured out these two parts of the equation. So they're much less happy than they should be because the lower brain has tricked them. And that's what we want to outfox the lower brain. All right. So that's a little bit about self-esteem brain, and all these, I'll just pop these up at the same time. Take a minute as a break, but also a way to visualize what triggers your self-esteem brain. What makes you have feelings of guilt or shame or embarrassment or failure or rejection? We want to actually trigger that part of the brain in order to practice shutting it off. That's when you become more higher brain dominant. We call that brain power, has the ability to shut off the self-esteem brain and say, that's a false story. We don't buy that. That's old. That's an old rationale for caring about hierarchy. Who cares? Just get at it and cycle and optimize and improve everything constantly. So think about this for just a minute. What are things that you find would be triggering for you from this list? So paradoxically, it's important for us to sit with discomfort in order to become more powerful. We need to learn to take on more embarrassment, more failure, more rejection. That's when we get the neural networks of brain power and stabilizing and shutting off the lower brain, and we become more and more subconsciously fearless. Now, another kind of brain hack, so that's false story, has to do with self-esteem. But another kind of brain hack is to recognize all the ways in which the lower brain gets triggered and just be self-aware. These are all the reasons for the lower brain to be triggered. We already talked about self-esteem, which is offended, but also FOMO, fear of missing out, craving, and anxiety, uncertainty, really it's like Wizard of Oz, and as the wizard is behind the curtain just controlling two levers, basically the O and the C. All of anxiety, most of anxiety comes from the fear of loss of status and loss of opportunity. But as we will show you in the next brain hack, as you become more and more creatively fearless, you're like, my happiness is totally in my control, and I'm actually going to be more successful if I don't worry about the outcome, but I cycle really fast, try new things, see what's working, not working. And so anxiety can go down, 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 as you saw with our results, when you realize what's behind it, and that we don't have to have control over the future as long as we're just iterating really fast and we have no fear of learning and getting help and trying new things. And then the hungry, irritated, tired, about hangry, of course. It's like 80% of the fights that occur in couples are because of low sugar levels. Is that crazy? 80% of the fights. And so these kinds of things also, if your lower brain's already activated, don't be having serious conversations, because it ain't going to go well, right? And so, for example, that's why we have a rule in my marriage which says, after 7 o'clock, you don't have serious conversations, because it goes trigger, 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 trigger. No matter how much I know this stuff, battery is depleted, higher brain is offline, lower brain's really vulnerable. And so come 6:45, I promise you, I'm in the bathroom just waiting for 7 o'clock to show up so I can not have to have any difficult conversations with the wife. I'm usually wrong, by the way. I'm not sure how that works out, but somehow that's how it goes. So be self-aware, be self-accepting, recognize your limits. If you're lower brain, walk away, reset, then have serious conversations. Don't have a serious conversation when you are lower brain. Bad things will happen. So that's why it's simply asking the question. Here's another brain hack. So we're giving you a bunch of lower brain shut-off brain hacks in this presentation. Am I lower brain? Simply being aware of whether you're lower brain and saying, I am lower brain right now, very interesting, allows you to actually step outside of the lower brain and activate the higher brain. It's the higher brain that's having that meta awareness of where you're at. The medial prefrontal cortex is a feeling state of where you're at. And so just being aware of all these signs of being lower brain activated allows us to say, yeah, you know what, I am kind of lower brain right now. And that creates a gap of separation, and the lower brain then goes off, and then you can put other brain hacks into that gap to reduce the likelihood of reactivating the lower brain. And so those are a few brain hacks to shut off the lower brain. A real quick hit on a higher brain activation, we call it change the game. We sort of hinted at it. Answer this question real quickly. What's the number one predictor of success and happiness at the workplace? Is it motivation by A, B, C, D, or E? So take a second to think about that. And we can predict almost everybody will say D, but in fact, the answer is, wait for it, C is the right answer. Based on social psychology, based on organizational outcomes, having a sense of play, and really enjoying what you're doing from moment to moment, and trying new things and iterating and seeing what's working and not working. That's Southwest Airlines and Starbucks and Apple. They have very high play ratings, right? So it's not sense of purpose. Sense of purpose is more of a lower brain motivation. It's really about legacy and status and having an impact on the world. And that doesn't work from moment to moment as far as being really dynamic and really happy and even really successful, to be honest. Because most of the time you're not having a big impact, and then you're bored because I'm not doing something profound, and you're not motivated to do what's in front of you with a kind of sense of mastery and excellence. And so if you look at, for example, here's when I do labor epidurals, when I do, put an epidural in someone who's laboring and in pain, I break it down into all these steps and little sub-steps, and the details don't matter. You can do that with, making coffee. You can do that with doing the laundry. And you can do that with anything as far as your processes in school, whether it's what's your process for behavior management, what's your process for leadership, What's your process for difficult conversations? What's your process for motivating a student, a classroom that seems de-energized? What are some tactics that you use for energizing a class, right? So you can create a process for anything. Everything is a neural network and a process map like this, if you choose to, and that allows you to be really playful and constantly tweak your system. And that is really powerful on multiple levels. Speaking of, we said max happiness, the reason to iterate and try new things and see what's working and not working is because it produces much more happiness, first of all. So the iterative process here, you can see here, of trying new things and even failing on a regular basis produces a much wider range of neurotransmitters, including dopamine and electrical signals, hormones, etc. Whereas the one-trick pony of dopamine and trying to do things for external validation or external pleasure is very sporadic, it's unpredictable, it's often disappointing, and your net happiness over time is inferior. But we're so beholden to the story of you need to move up and you need to make a lot of money and you need to have an impact, that we get trapped into an inferior form of happiness and an inferior form of success. Why? Because it turns out that your ability to tolerate feedback, as we said, is the key to becoming more powerful, whether it's brain power of shutting the lower brain off, how fast you learn, skills, knowledge, models of understanding, or social power and how you develop skill in social connection. It's a function of how much you can tolerate feedback. And there's great books that show that on the East Coast and the West Coast, they figured this out. They figured out that iterating really quickly is the key to creating big organizations like Google and Apple and Microsoft and Netflix. They've all figured out being agile, which means to iterate really quickly, is the key. And that way of functioning is coming down the pipeline. So we all have to learn it. All industries are going to be going to this agile way of thinking. And so learning to iterate, change the game, gamifying what you do is really exhilarating, but it also forces you to trigger the lower brain and shut it off. And it forces you to become, more and more creatively fearless and better in command of the stress response system. And so we talked about Silicon Valley and how this is a revolution coming down the pipeline, and I'm getting short on time, so I won't spend too much time on this agile methodology, but it's all really about innovating and measuring and just cycling really fast. Whatever you do, whatever job you have, whatever task you have can be turned into a process map, and then you can keep innovating and just really having a blast and becoming more powerful in the process. And so it's really important to change the story. We're so self-protective, so worried about looking bad. We're all in leadership roles. We tend to be perfectionists and obsessive compulsive, and that's gotten us to a certain point, but then it's not getting us to the promised land of maximum happiness. So we need to undo some really bad lower brain habits. And this is a perspective for the rest of your school staff. If you choose to teach these kinds of tools to the rest of your school staff, it's like, which snowflake is the most beautiful is the question that we ask. And it's like, yeah, in Wisconsin, this is a trick question. None of them, because once it's past a couple inches, it's a pain in the you-know-what. But at the crystal level, they're beautiful. And the same thing applies to, what's your job? All jobs are amenable to genius. Genius is just the density of your neural networks in your craft. This idea of someone doctor is better than nurse or principal is better than the lunch person, it's made up. It's a false story. It's really all jobs and tasks are amenable to genius and expanding neural networks and process maps to get better and better and masterful of that area and having fun in innovating and assessing what's working and not working. So we can give our people a renewed sense of mission and purpose right where they are, rather than focused on this, what's my purpose and what's my impact on the world? And that's secondary. If it happens, fine. But if you're in love with what you do, you fall in love and you're playful, it's really it lights up the higher brain. It's a really great brain hack to change the game, which is a kind of new narrative about how to motivate why you do what you do. So we need to keep the focus on beauty, and really everybody matters. This notion of, we're so stuck in the narrative of hierarchical thinking and valuing some things more than the other. And to me, it's all silliness. Um, but if it were so easy, the lower brain still is like a horror movie, right? You're like, hey, I know how to shut my lower brain off, and I'm going to be more higher brain. And if only it were so easy, right? The lower brain's been around for a couple million years. It's got a couple tricks up its sleeve, and so it turns out there's Nobel Prize-winning studies, including the work of Kahneman and Tversky, that show that our prime motivator in life is the avoidance of loss. So this ain't easy to structure. You have to structure your life in order to become higher brain dominant. So there's another trick that you need to bring to this battle. And because the tendency is going to be for your lower brain to seduce you out of going down what we call the dopamine drop bridge, right? You're going to have to tolerate more failure, rejection, and loss the more you iterate, right? And so you have to learn how to shut that dopamine system off in order for it to cause less discomfort. And eventually you become unafraid of that discomfort, and no problem being vulnerable, and no problem, asking for help and looking silly. But initially you have to organize your life in order to make sure that you're doing this on a regular basis and intentionally triggering your lower brain on a regular basis, and then shutting it off and intentionally activating the higher brain. And then you start noticing changes happening, and you're really motivated to be a scientist of your brain. And so really the formula that we have developed, and it works really well, is you welcome discomfort, and then you actually create discomfort on purpose, stage 2, by being more gamifying everything. And then we can teach tools, meditation, yoga, breathing, certain breathing techniques, visualization techniques. There's a whole range from the front of the brain, higher brain, to the back of the higher brain. You can directly activate the higher brain. Then we take our game to another level, which is we structure discomfort into our routine. Process maps is one way to do it, but there's other ways to do it where you can really force the agenda of regularly being uncomfortable in order to become higher brain dominant, in order to become more creatively fearless, in order to have a life that's more exhilarating and more effective, frankly. And then finally, if you want to take this all the way, do this as a group. And that's why group work is really exciting, like school systems, for example, because then everyone's speaking the same language, everyone's helping each other out, everyone's also holding each other accountable for going lower brain or higher brain. And so that's a structure that almost guarantees that the vast majority of that community are going to become higher brain dominant over time. We've seen it, and I'll show you some other results. And so we've got a mental health crisis right now. We need you, especially. You're in the middle of it. You're drowning in it, unfortunately. You're being blamed for everything under the sun. Parents are upset with you. The kids are falling apart. But it turns out that I think school systems are the key to teaching these kinds of tools. And we need to stop this left versus right, Fox versus MSNBC, conservative versus progressive. It's the wrong battle plane. We cannot fight against each other. Lincoln's, a house divided cannot stand. We have to band together, because China and India are coming down the pipeline, and they have each over 1 billion people who are hungry, motivated, have self-belief. We cannot be fighting amongst ourselves. We have to recognize that the battle is actually lower brain versus higher brain, not left versus right. And there's good evidence that when we sit together for a long period of time, a day, for example, that we do end up being pretty common in our understanding of 95% of what the keys are to being happy and secure and fulfilled. And so based on our outcomes data, there is really good hope. And I would say that, nothing can be more meaningful than becoming higher brain dominant. Nothing can be more purposeful than teaching this to others. It's just the coolest game in town is to do this. And then, oh, by the way, you become more creatively fearless because you can tolerate lower brain activation, and that will allow you to become even more successful than you are now. And education level doesn't matter. We've proven that. Right? So we want to give a message to the staff that your education does not preclude you from becoming higher brain dominant, does not preclude you from teaching this to others, does not preclude you from being creative at improving all kinds of processes. Has nothing to do with educational level. That's a very democratizing message, and it really invigorates the culture even more. Everyone can do this. I want to just show you some data. I think I've hit on this enough in terms of why I think schools are the key to our society. Frankly, this is an existential crisis. So this, yes, oh, by the way, you're going to have better mental health and better culture. That's great. But we also need you to teach this to other people. So I'm kind of a little bit worried about where we are right now. We've done this for many organizations and many school systems. Again, thanks in part to Michelle and Jim in particular. And so you can see some of these testimonials from, really great leaders, principals, director of curriculum in the case of Sue Kern. But they speak to, resilience and adaptability and culture. And in that regard, I want to show you something really impressive, which is look at the outcomes. This is from Shell Lake in terms of psychological safety. Look at these results. These are all questions, and you can read this for yourself, but they pertain to psychological safety, which is the ability to be fearless, to be authentic, to put ideas out there, to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to be, different in your thinking. And you can see the before and after is profound, right? A big improvement in psychological safety. And there's even more questions that we ask, and you can see how those results, improve. Oh, this is nice that people like the job because it's fun to do. Was really high from the get-go, which is really encouraging to see. But the point is that when a community becomes more higher brain dominant, beautiful things start to happen. And that's culture transformation. And this is 12 hours of content over a 6-month period. It's remarkable. And then it just feeds off of itself, right? So it becomes sustaining because everybody knows this toolkit and this language, and they just keep reinforcing it for each other. So again, very, very hopeful. And with that, I will stop, and happy to have you ask any questions. And if we have extra time, I even have a worksheet that I can draw your attention to. But these are some of the things that we talked about. And I'll give you a minute first to sort of focus on this list of what we talked about, and sort of reinforce some of the concepts that washed over you. And then after a minute, I'll take any questions. So let's take a minute break and just sort of meditate on this list here. In the meantime, let me also pull up the chat here. It's a lot to take in, I realize that, but you've got the recording. You can watch it again. But in the meantime, what questions do you have right now? You can chat them, or you can just, we have a small enough group, you can just get on the horn and just start asking. Just seeing what other slides I have here. And if you have any questions, down the line, you are also welcome to just email us. We could talk about this stuff 24/7. And if you need more help connecting, we're happy to do that. Someone said, what does it look like when Leo works with the school system? Yeah, I think we've had lots of different versions of this program with multiple school systems, as we said here. And really it's simply, you can do a kickoff for a couple hours, and then we do virtual, or if you're really local to us, you can do kind of 1 hour session every 2 to 4 weeks, and so you distribute it over 3 to 6 months, and so it's 12 hours of content sort of sliced up over a period of 3 to 6 months in chunks that work for you. And so we do a kind of a hybrid. Some in school systems that are far away, Shell Lake, with those really amazing mental health and psychological safety results, was all virtual. Oh, thanks. Sarah also put a link to the flyer on there that's got some of the data and sort of what the configuration of the program is. And funding seems to have been not a problem because school systems, there's so much, thankfully, so much mental health. I mean, unfortunately, it's because there's such a crisis. But the good news is between Title I, Title II, Title IV, ESSER funds, that seems to have seems to not be an issue. And we've got this priced very moderately. So the goal is to make it, to scale it. We're not concerned about profit. So that's how it works in terms of the number of hours divided up over a period of months. And then we kind of measure the before, during, and after effect in terms of mental health and psychological safety, or what we say is culture. It's the best predictor of culture. Hopefully that sort of answers your question. Please feel free to elaborate on that more if you need more information.
Yeah, if we were wanting to set something up, would there be a maximum size for like a virtual platform delivery of this, maximum audience size?
Yeah, so there's a couple, I think, we can certainly work with, up to 200-300 people. We can chunk it up. The other option, so we can do multiple chunks like that. If it's 1,000 people, we can chunk it up into chunks of 250 to 300 people at a time. And the other option to consider is we have not only in-service and the workshop, the third option is train the trainer, where we're excited to also train your folks in being able to deliver this system to the rest of the school, whether it's the adults and then eventually the kids. So for example, Chippewa Falls, we just trained 20 people there to be certified in Leo and really understanding the essence of the concepts and how to make them come alive. And so those are the options. Yeah, so I really don't think there is. There's no really limit to how many we can deal with. Thank you. Other questions? Now, self-esteem as a waste of time is a very triggering concept, right? So one of the clarifications is that self-worth, we say, is a higher brain aspect of self-worth is the ability to be adaptable. That's a higher brain version of maybe self-esteem. Or creatively joyful is also a higher brain version of self-esteem. The tricky one and the dominant one is lower brain self-esteem, where we're concerned about social rank. And the real test of that is how much you can tolerate dependence, vulnerability, failure, rejection. And the reason you want to expose that system is that it subconsciously dissuades you from taking risk in life, in growing, in learning, in connecting. And that's the scary aspect of the self-esteem, the lower brain self-esteem system, just to add a little bit more clarity on that. Yeah, sure, go ahead, Sarah. Sarah's going to also post the activity handout. And this is something you can do on your own as kind of homework, if you will. Kind of take a look at sort of, and I'll pop it up here just to show you what that looks like, but it's really kind of doing a deeper dive on signs of lower brain activation. Sorry, I gotta click through these slides here. So we've got these 3 sheets here, or maybe they're, 3. So, on the left is sort of an exercise on being aware of signs of lower brain activation, and they're numerous, body signs and brain signs and relationship signs. And then there's signs that your higher brain is coming online. And so that's really cool. You'll start to notice evidence that you're becoming a little bit more higher brain dominant, and that just lights the fire motivationally of wanting to do this stuff all the time, because it's the coolest thing. Paul.
Sure.
Go for it.
Jumping in for a minute. A question that's often asked is, boy, about the train the trainer and teaching this is, not a medical professional, can this be done? And so I'm kind of living proof it's worked well. I've been teaching now for about 4 years, and I'm an engineer. I have my MBA and no medical background, not a neuroscientist. It's really just learning the framework and then really starting with working on myself and then sharing it. And it's been a great journey.
Yeah, Paul has taken over our workshop at UW, delivering it to leaders. and he's been very effective. He's got really great scores, and he's going to be helping us on the school side since we're starting to really expand in the school world, and it's our favorite thing to do. And so, yeah, this should be very inspirational that you do not have to have a medical degree. You know, we got a little bit into the brain science, but that's just to show you that there's firepower behind these concepts. The concepts are really very actionable and practical, and do not require any kind of medical background to learn this, to teach this. Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Raj, you alluded to it, but I wonder if you could provide a little bit more background. So as we think about why is it in 2022, and you know, for the last couple of decades, we see so much anxiety, depression, etc., and sort of so many of us are triggered in low brain too frequently, you know, and you mentioned like our history, and a lot of us think of, you know, grandpa and grandma on the farm as this quaint, you know, many years ago kind of a notion. But could you go back to sort of our history as a people, and you know, why we're at where we're at as we think about it in those terms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, it's sort of the curse of success in a way, in that we became so successful as a nation and so wealthy and so dominant in terms of status that we kind of got hooked on that dopamine system of external validation and external pleasure. And what happened in the meantime over the last 50 years is what I would say is our adaptability quotient really dropped. So what's key to being adaptable? Community is very important. We are rugged individualists, right? We're proud of that. But the reality is the reason we have a dropping life expectancy compared to all other wealthy nations, many feel it's because of a lack of community mechanisms to allow for stability psychologically and to be adaptable. Also, you know, we don't have as much emotional adaptability. We are, you know, a lot more shame and pride driven. And so we have a tendency to not be able to talk about emotions, especially negative emotions. And the paradox is if you can't talk about them, your lower brain is going to be raging in the background, causing all kinds of destruction. Intellectual adaptability is low because we've, I think, in a sense, made it into a beauty contest where some of us who do really well in school win the beauty contest of academics, but the rest feel, you know, not smart. But it turns out that that's a false narrative. But I think the problem is we don't want to learn. We're not in love with learning as much, and so that's another aspect of adaptability. Tolerance for feedback, you know, accountability, that becomes pretty low, you know, especially if you have more access to external dopamine from the internet and smartphones and fast food and all these kinds of things. It becomes easier to keep going there, but it leads to a lot more emptiness, boredom, depression, addiction. But even more scary is a reduction in adaptability. And so what happens when the world is changing really fast, like it is right now? If you don't feel like you can adapt, you freak out. And that's kind of what's happening is we have a freak out happening right now because the adaptability quotient is so low, and our dopamine dependence is so high, external dopamine dependence. And so we're falling a lot farther, triggering this panic attack, amplified by the fact that we don't know how to adapt. The good news about this stuff is you can teach people this stuff and they become much more adaptable much more quickly, and that stabilizes us psychologically, and they're like, okay, we can deal with the future. And the reality is we still have the greatest platform for creativity in the world. The United States, I'm so grateful to be an American, and my heart breaks that there's such a division between sides, but we still have the greatest platform for creativity. If you have an idea, there's a marketplace for it, and there's an audience for it, and a marketplace for it. And so, and there's twice as many jobs as there are people who are applying for jobs. And so we need to reassure people, listen, let's give you a toolkit to become more adaptable because the world is changing really fast. We get it. That creates a lot of anxiety. Anxiety is fear of the unknown. And so I think it's a combination of those two things, coming off of a dopamine high and then not having the adaptability to find new pathways to create dopamine.
Thanks, Raj.
Thanks, Jim. And we didn't plan that. Jim and I like to riff like this, and Paul and Michelle. Any other thoughts on these concepts? And I can also jump around to slides if there's something you want me to pull back to.
I have a thought, Dr. Raj. This is Cale Zeicher. I serve
Yeah,
as
just call me Raj. Thank you.
Raj.
Cale.
Okay. I serve as an intermediate school principal, so 4th and 5th grade in Altoona by Eau Claire. Really appreciate this. Is awesome learning. I've
Thank
loved
you.
it. I just want to know your thoughts kind of on application of this in a school setting, specifically to like a PBIS system. So, and this is a guy, me. I've read and loved like Alfie Cullen's work for the last 6 years. I really vibe with that. And I've been thinking about during this webinar about how we implicitly and sometimes explicitly activate lower brain functioning in our kids, maybe through like rewards and validation, and as well-meaning as intentional as it is. I'm just curious about what your thoughts are, not on the teaching of PBIS concepts, like we want to teach positive behavior, we want to reteach positive behavior, what that looks like, but I'm curious about what your thoughts are with the recognition and reinforcements of that.
That's a fantastic question, Cale. I mean, in the longer version, we actually dive into that quite a bit. I'm sure you're familiar with Carol Dweck's work, Mindset, and growth mindset versus fixed mindset, and a lot of that work was done in schools. And it's kind of funny, like reading that work, I realized I made every mistake in parenting you could possibly make. It's like the big cheerleader on the side when they did really well at the soccer tournament or did well on an assignment, and it turns out that validation for outcomes is very tricky. It's actually problematic for the most part, that you don't want to validate people or kids for being beautiful or smart or talented, or that backfires, because what ends up happening is they become hooked on the self-esteem system. And I did this to my son for sure, because he was a really good athlete and I made a big deal about it. Then it's like, whoa, I don't want to go to the next level because I don't want to feel that dopamine drop. I'm used to having this nice little validation. I'm fine staying in JV. I mean, he could have been a varsity soccer player as a freshman, but he's like, nope, not interested because I'm not interested in that dopamine drop. Well, I didn't know what that was at the time. And so I think there is something profound about that I think we need to put the focus on, like, change the game. We need to put the focus on, man, that was a really cool, you had a good outcome, but let's bring it back to, what did you learn? Like, what was your scientific process? What did you innovate? What did you discover? What do you want to do next? Elon Musk, they said, you're the richest man in the world. He's like, that's really interesting, back to work. He's enamored with the platform that, not that he's the perfect person in the world, perfect human being, but, he's enamored by the platform. I think the same thing, and we're helping a young man to get on the PGA Tour. He's actually in first place right now in the Wisconsin State Open. We've been mentoring him for a couple of years, and great young man, Austin Konjorski. And he's learned this stuff, and he's learned to just be in love with being a scientist of everything, a scientist of his brain, a scientist of his process, a scientist of his biomechanics. He's doing well. He's leading the Wisconsin State Open, and we're all like, whatever, if that works out, that's fine. If it doesn't work out, that's fine. But what are you discovering right now? Like, what do you want to work on? How's your brain doing? How's your body doing? How's your decision making doing right now? And you're just constantly tweaking this process and these neural networks and teaching people to fall in love with gamification. The outcomes will take care of themselves. And a big point that we make also is success is so much luck is involved. Like for me, like there's 8 or 9 things that got handed to me, right? In terms of being able to do well academically, having supportive parents, having confidence at the right time. It's like, there's so much luck involved. You should not focus on outcomes and personal validation. It's a trap. I hope that kind of addresses, I think so I think positive behavior in terms of just self-awareness and growth and vulnerability and, being a scientist and being in love with discovery and the journey and not making such a big deal about the outcome. That's my Cliff Notes version. Thank you. Great question. Other thoughts? This is fun.
Yeah, Raj, you shared some data on, survey feedback from teens. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what what has that looked like in spaces where you've worked with students?
Yeah, so this is really exciting. I mean, that was derived from, and I'm going to try to see if I can jump forward to that or jump back to that. You're not seeing the slides right now, are you?
No,
Okay, good, because I want to make sure I don't give you a seizure from seeing these slides jumping around. I'm going to try to get right to that point. But so that was we got a Department of Children and Families grant, the Brighter Futures Initiative, BFI. We got that grant. I did it in collaboration with Tom Preet. He actually was in the same workshop that Paul was in, the very first workshop we did at UW. And so Tom is the owner of CW Solutions, which works with social service agencies in Wood County. And he's like, hey, by the way, I love the workshop and we have 2 weeks before the deadline. You interested in submitting for this grant? I'm like, sounds good. I can give you about a half an hour to just riff on some background and how we would design it. Lo and behold, we got the, a couple $100,000 grant, thanks mostly to his work. And so that we delivered it in 2019. It was, they delivered it. They're taking our material and sort of simplifying it a little bit. And so the first cohort had those results, and I'm going to see if I can pull those back up here so we can talk about it at the same time. Okay, let's see if this works to jump right back to that. Hey, it worked. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah. So so then it was about 100 kids, and then it was a 1-year follow-up. So even better long-term impact study. And the 1-year follow-up was April 2020, which is the worst time possible to do a survey because of COVID, the freak out about COVID was happening right at that point in time. And so it was like, oh man. So it was about 60 kids filled it out. And in fact, that cohort had worse outcomes than the overall cohort. So there wasn't this self-selection bias. Sometimes you worry about the ones who answer it or they're doing it because they're really happy. Turns out that this cohort was worse in terms of their immediate after program outcomes. So this is 1 year out. Interestingly, then when COVID hit, it was all virtual and that was a mess. That did not go well. So those results weren't as good. And now we're getting back to in person. So we figured out by a natural experiment that the kids have to have this kind of in person. So this is a program where CW Solutions and a couple trainers are distributing it to the kids. Our feeling is that we want to work with the school staff and empower them to distribute it to the kids because then it's all woven into the culture. So that's a unique setup in Wood, and now it's expanded. We got the grant that got expanded to Adams County. That's sort of bottom up. It's going directly to the kids, and the teachers kind of don't know what the LEO program is for them. They have a sense of it, but they don't really know it. Our feeling is that it should go top down because then the adults are going to just role model it in the nooks and crannies of the day-to-day. And can also then teach it formally. So we're super excited about partnerships with school systems to innovate in this space. Like you guys are the experts of the kids, but I think we can we can combine chocolate and peanut butter and do something pretty cool here. And there's enough evidence to show it's going to work. Does that help? Yeah, thank you. Great questions. Any other thoughts? Yeah, contact at Leo Program if you ever have any questions, or Raj at leoprogram.com. Like I said, we work on this stuff 7 days a week, so we will get back to you pretty quickly, and happy to kind of sort of dream about how this could configure into your setting and how. And I think some people rightfully and worry about sustainability, but that's the beauty of having the whole school staff go through it, is that then everyone's talking about it and it just permeates the culture. It's a common language, it's common understanding, common tools, and so it will sustain itself. But even icing on the cake is if you want to do the train the trainer, that's always available if need be. Here's a chat. Let me pull that up. Cool. No, that's just an internal message. Okay, if we are good on questions, we're happy to wrap it up. Jim, any closing thoughts on your part? Thank you again so much for having us. We really appreciate that.
Raj, thank you. Thanks for the time. And thanks everybody for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of the day. Like Raj said, we will have the recording available if anybody wants to watch it again, share it with a colleague, all those sorts of things. So thanks so much. Thanks, Raj. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye. Take care.
Enjoy the day.